Welcome to the Allensack National Symposium, Advancing Integrity in College Sport.
We come to you from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The topic, giving college athletes the right to unionize.
So I'd like to begin by introducing people who are sitting up here with me. On my far left is Michael Hausfeld. Michael is a distinguished attorney who has an abiding interest in social reform and a long list of successful antitrust cases that he's pursued over the years. He won an important injunction in the landmark O'Bannon case that opened the door to name, image, and likeness. To my immediate left is Kaya McCullough, who was an outstanding soccer player at UCLA and went on to become a professional soccer player in the National Women's Soccer League, and has been very involved in fighting racism in U.S. sports and U.S. society. She is the chairwoman of the Anti-Racist Soccer Club. And about to join us on the big screen is Bob Costas. Bob is a 29-time winner of Emmy Awards, and he has, of course, a list of honors and accolades that would take me all morning to recite. I think Bob needs no further introduction. Good morning, Bob. Nice to see you.
Hello, Andy. How are you?
Good, thanks. If I could, Bob, I think nobody understands the landscape of U.S. sports better than you do. If you could kick us off before we start focusing more directly on unionization or possible unionization of college athletes, if you could kick us off with some of your thoughts on the state of college sports today and possibilities for its reform.
Andy, I'm going to present a general point and in general defer to those on the panel and to Senator Murphy, who might have more specific expertise about some of the legal aspects, or in Senator Murphy's case, the bill that he's presented regarding unionization for athletes, and get to this larger general point. Even as we discuss all of the needed reforms and accept the idea that in many instances, collegiate athletes are exploited, we commonly hear what I think is kind of a glib phrase: everybody's getting rich off this except the athletes. What do the athletes get out of this? And what this almost assumes is that the education itself has no value whatsoever. If the college presidents were to have the courage and the will to say, look, we will monitor all of the admissions, especially not so much crew or tennis or field hockey or lacrosse, but in the revenue producing sports, which is where the corruption takes place and where to a certain extent the exploitation happens. The revenue producing sports, which would be men's football, well, there's only men's football, men's basketball, and in many instances now, women's basketball. If we were to monitor all those admissions and make sure that every student athlete who is admitted to our university meets the minimum standards that any other student who is not an athlete would have to meet, and that allows for exceptions. We always make legitimate exceptions in admissions for the circumstances and background of the student, or if the student has special abilities that can't be measured necessarily by grade point average. That includes athletics, but it could include an ability in music or whatever it might be, or a specific background which adds to the diversity of a university. All of that is legitimate, but none of that justifies someone who's functionally illiterate being admitted to any university. Every university has different standards, sometimes even within conferences where those universities meet on the playing field or on the court. Vanderbilt's standards are different than Alabama's standards. Boston College's standard is different than Ohio State's standard. Stanford's standard is different than Texas A&M's standard, but they all have some standard of some kind. And if those standards would have to be met under the scrutiny of people who do not have a direct interest in the one-loss record of that particular team, where the employment of the coach and to a certain extent the athletic director depends upon the success on the field of the team, which is not an irrelevant consideration, but it has to be in some sense aligned with the academic mission of a university. If the college presidents were to say that no one gets into our university who could not plausibly be a student, not necessarily a Rhodes Scholar or even a Dean's List person within that university, but could not plausibly meet the basic standards of this university if it did not have a football or basketball team. If that were the case, a lot of the issues that we'll talk about today, important as they are, would not be as acute as they presently are, because some of it derives from having an out of whack relationship between academics and athletics. When a student arrives, let's say a football player, on a campus and plays his first game, maybe his first 2 games, before he ever attends a class. In basketball, when over Thanksgiving or Christmas, a freshman is traveling to Alaska or points unknown to play a tournament, what does that tell that young man, even if he has a reasonable intention to be a student? What does that tell that young person about what he is really there to do, what the purpose of this is? If we got that into a better and more proportionate relationship, if we began to question why Boise State has to play Syracuse during the regular season, not during a tournament, or why conferences are now aligned in ways that make no geographic sense and have nothing to do with traditional rivalries, but only for television money, or why when COVID first hit, before there were any vaccines, we were damn sure going to figure out a way to play college football, even though on those campuses, the students were basically locked down and adhering to all manner of COVID protocols. And when we say, usually in the name of advocating for legitimate reforms, the athletes are being exploited, well, that almost says that we, the reformers, don't think that an education honestly pursued has any value. That athlete is sitting next to someone whose parents worked 2 and 3 jobs to put him or her and their siblings through college. An education that, if you apply yourself, is worth a damn bit of good. It's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in a practical sense at most universities over a 4-year period of time. I think we've become so cynical about this that even the reformers seem to believe that the primary reason student athletes are there is the athlete part, not the student part. Another thing that I think we ought to call out is this. We often hear it said glibly that athletes as a group have a higher graduation rate than their non-athletic peers at a university. We have to make a distinction. That's certainly true in the non-revenue producing sports. Those athletes as a group graduate at a much higher rate than their non-athletic student peers. And also, if you have a football team that has like 80 or 90, if you count walk-on players, yeah, many of those players will graduate. But the graduation rate is much lower for the core, the star players in the revenue-producing sports, especially when compared to those students who are there for 4 years. If someone is at a university for 2 years and leaves for perfectly good reasons, they were a student in good standing. If Michael Jordan leaves after his junior year at North Carolina, he's a student in good standing and has every reason to leave. I've never fudged the fact that I did not graduate from Syracuse. I was a student in good standing. I was 12 credits shy of graduation, and I was offered a job at KMOX Radio in St. Louis, one of the biggest radio stations in the country, and I did what any sane person would have done. I went to St. Louis and I embarked upon my career. I had been a good student at Syracuse. The fact that I do not have an undergraduate degree has not stopped them from asking me for money or asking me to MC their various events or giving me an honorary doctorate. I skipped right over the master's portion and now I have a doctorate from Syracuse. But I was a student in good standing. If we compare apples and oranges with graduation rates, and you got some ball player who was there for 4 years, maybe 5, if he was redshirted, and during that period of time was never really a legitimate student and is left without the requisite skills to be successful in society if he doesn't turn out to have a multi-million-dollar athletic career. That person is an outlier, and there's no real comparison to the overall student body.
Well, thank you very much. Can I try a follow-up?
Sure.
Bob, can you hear when people laugh at your jokes and applaud at your comments or not? Are you hearing that? I just want to...
A little.
A little bit.
I'd really like further affirmation if you could arrange it. I can hear it a little.
Well, okay. There was just 5 minutes of applause. Everybody's standing in the audience.
Of course they are.
Yeah. So follow-up question, your hope that we can rebalance the scales and refocus some on the educational aspect of student-athletes' experience. Where do you think changing the status of student-athletes into a status as employee and potentially union members, how do you think that fits into the possibilities and likelihood for rebalancing the scales?
I'm skeptical that if it's a direct employer-employee relationship, I believe that would further corrupt what should be the relationship, the student-athlete relationship. That doesn't mean that student-athletes shouldn't have protections. NIL certainly makes a great deal of sense. Stipends, if you're recruiting someone to come from a great distance away from this campus, and that person may not have the financial wherewithal and resources that most of his fellow students do, a stipend to help that person navigate the college experience, or to be able, and this next reform is already in place, but to be able to go home if a parent is sick or a grandparent dies or something like that. But if we're talking about a direct employment situation, I don't know how that shakes out. I would think that a tiny percentage, probably less than 1% of star athletes would make a lot of money, and the rest of their teammates would not. It would turn it into an officially professional relationship rather than an amateur relationship. I think if the reforms that I was talking about were in place, there are now functioning farm systems in place. The NBA has the G League. They could easily expand it. Basketball rosters are small, so that could already be in place. A lot of us didn't think for a long time, did not think it was possible to have a farm system in football. But the country, for better or worse, is so football obsessed that USFL games involving coaches and players that even avid fans cannot identify are now on network television. And the second iteration of the XFL, before COVID shut it down, was actually on its way to being very successful. So it's entirely possible that the NBA and the NFL could have larger functioning farm systems. No one complains when a hockey player goes directly from high school to some form of pro hockey, or a baseball player, although many more baseball players play college baseball than did generations ago. If a baseball player signs when he's 17, 18 years old, his high school class has graduated, he goes right into pro ball, goes right into the minor leagues. Nobody says, oh, this is a travesty, you should have gone to college. I think that if that were in place, a lot of those who are only using college as a springboard to the pros, and even though they're the most visible, they're a tiny percentage, that percentage would lessen because they would go directly to professional basketball or some version of professional football, and the relationship on the college level would be less cynical.
Thank you. I wonder if I can ask Michael Hausfeld to chime in on this question of whether the introduction of treating college athletes as employees and possible unionization would have an impact on the educational functions of going to school.
Thank you, Andrew. First, I'd like to thank you for putting me as well and introducing me as being on the far left, because I usually am. The issue of college athletes, I think, is clouded most importantly by the surface association of college athletes with, as Bob Costa said, revenue-producing sports. There are more college athletes than those just in revenue-producing sports. Making them employees is not going to solve the issue, again, as Mr. Costa said, of their academic achievement, and/or rights. This is probably one of the most complex issues that the mixture of business and academics has ever presented, both socially, economically, and legally. So let me, if I can, unpack it somewhat, because if you look at college sports as a spectrum, how do you divide it? It's skewed by revenue-producing sports. So do we need to make rules for just the revenue-producing sports? And if so, what is the benchmark level of revenue to qualify as a revenue-producing sport? Do you look at unionizing the athletes by school, by conference, by sport, by gender, by division? If you make them employees, do you unionize them? Well, do they fit a concept of a union? A union are a group of similarly situated employees that have got a common goal and a relative longevity with regard to that goal. College athletes in even revenue-producing sports do not have that kind of longevity. Sports associations protect not only their current athletes, but their retired athletes. Unionization doesn't work for the college athlete, even in revenue-producing sports, because there is no ability for the union representatives to think about what it is that should be provided for those who retire. There is no long-term commitment by the student athlete who may be in school 4 to 5 years, although with my kids, we found a mug that I think, captured really the educational experience. It was college, the best 7 years of my life. If it was 7, that would be more than some of them have. But after that, they do go on to the next stage. So it becomes very difficult to put all of this together when you add as well the complexity of a deeply embedded emotional, association with this is my school, this is my team. I don't believe that unionization is the answer. There are academic issues, there are economic issues, there are athletic issues, and as well, there are medical issues, health and safety. All of those issues could be addressed by an association, a group association of the athletes. But again, you've got to look at the different stakeholders. You've got the universities that are supposed to emphasize academics. You have the conferences, which are now combining universities in ways that they were never meant to be combined or put together, influencing not only what games get played, but where they get played and when they get played, putting demands on the ability of the athlete to satisfy their academic objectives. And you have then as well the medical issues. What do you do with health and safety? The NCAA, in a case that was filed a long time ago, said, we do not have any rules, with regard to the health and safety of our athletes. What is the role of the NCAA? Condoleezza Rice and a commission that was, in essence, formed or created by the NCAA said, the state of college sports is deeply troubled. The levels of corruption and deception are now at a point that they threaten the very survival of the college game as we know it. That has been a mantra of the Knight Commission for decades, as well as the Great Drake Group. When we talk about the athlete that's committed, to being educated, many are. But are they given the opportunity? How many times have we seen over decades, not only is there economic corruption, but academic fraud at major institutions where the athletes are not given the opportunity, particularly in the revenue-producing sports, to achieve those academic objectives because of the pressure to meet their athletic commitments. I remember one college coach saying, no, we have the term backwards. They are not student athletes. They are athlete students. As one former president of our country said, this is hard work to figure out how to do this, but there is a need to do it. Everything that Bob Costas said is correct. Athletes should have the ability to be educated, and not just, again, in college, because the reach goes below college to high school and even junior high school, when young people are asked to commit to a particular university at a point in time when they may not know what is best for them or not best for them. So how do we approach this? I think overall we've got to see what kind of system needs to be put in place. How do we serve all of the stakeholders? How do we preserve the integrity of the academic institutions, the emotion of the sport, and the rights of the athlete, regardless of school, division, conference, or gender? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Kaya, you want to take a crack at that simple subject?
I don't know. It's interesting. I just had my whole entire life described before me in that speech. So it's a complex issue. Yeah, as you said, I was forced to make a decision about where I wanted to attend college when I was 14 years old, which is way younger than anybody should be making a decision about their future. And then when I was at UCLA, I was arguably working over 40-hour weeks to produce for my non-revenue producing sport, women's soccer. And I think in a lot of ways, if I wasn't an overachiever in academics, my education would have suffered. And in a lot of ways, I wasn't even able to pursue the exact degree that I wanted because of my commitment to my sport, which seems like a minor thing. I was a political science major at UCLA, and I ended up specializing in American politics, but I really wanted to specialize in race and politics, especially given my identity intersection as a Black woman, as a Black athlete. And I was unable to simply because of my time commitments. There was never class available when I was available to do them. I had to travel for soccer. I remember we had to give these specific letters that were printed out specifically for student athletes in order to give to our professors at the beginning of class when the quarter system started. And if there was going to be too many conflicts, we would be booted from the class because we just simply couldn't keep up with the academic rigor. And so I think, at least what I think my presence on this panel is just offering an in-person look about the effects that some of these issues that we're talking about in a theoretical sense, they actually have implications on everyday people like me who loved the sport that they played and were so excited to play college and represent their university, but also suffered very real consequences because of it.
Thank you. So, Bob, I was intrigued by the comment you made regarding the further development of minor league sports in basketball and in football. I've always wondered why the NFL and the NBA were able to use college sports as their training grounds. The average Major League Baseball team spends approximately $30 million on minor league baseball and bonuses that the minor league players are given. It's true that the NBA now has the G League, a development league, and there's probably a $2 or $3 million commitment per team. The NFL basically has nothing. So I think structurally there's a very strong argument to doing that and to not further commercialize and monetize college sports when there's a clear option towards further development of minor league sports in those areas. So I'm wondering, given your proximity to these sports, whether you think that there would be some receptivity on the part of Roger Goodell and NFL owners and Adam Silver and NBA owners to further invest in the minor leagues, or how you would see a political process unfolding that looked towards that development of minor league ball.
Well, over time, things may have changed a bit in recent years, but over time, obviously, it was in the interests, let's say, of the NBA to just let college basketball operate as its farm system. By and large, those young athletes are receiving good coaching, but just as important, now this landscape has changed in college basketball with so many good players coming out after just a year or two. But think back a generation or so, there were players coming out of the college ranks who weren't just ready to play in the NBA, they were already household names because they played 3 or 4 years of college basketball. So when you had the NBA draft, it's who's going to get Patrick Ewing, who's going to get Chris Mullin, or who's going to get Michael Jordan, or whatever the case might have been. That was a built-in PR machine. The landscape of college sports has changed, and college basketball especially, to where the coaches are actually bigger stars than the players by and large, because the coaches are the fixtures. But in any case, in both football and basketball, over time, the college ranks have served as their minor league training system, where the coaching by and large is good. In the case of football, in fairness to Roger Goodell and the NFL, it's more likely that an 18, 19, 20-year-old basketball player could play in the NBA or play in the G League than a football player could, because the development that's required, the physical development training that's required to play football, a brutally violent sport, to play that at age 18, 19 at the highest level might be more problematic, except for a select few. But as we discussed, there are now the outlets for it. Television and all of its ever-growing platforms demands programming. And some of that programming can be less than elite competition, but it still draws eyeballs. As I mentioned, the XFL and the USFL. So it's absolutely practical for basketball. There could be a different commercial landscape now for football that would make it practical, probably not for 18-year-olds, but maybe for 20-year-olds. But then circling back to some of the points that we were making earlier, do practices have to be as long as they are, even if you're not traveling? Do you have to practice 5 and 6 hours a day? Are people aware, even those who follow this fairly closely, that in basketball, for example, a freshman who is talented and sees himself as a one and done, so-called one and done, I'll come for 1 year, and now then the rules will allow me to jump from the college ranks to the NBA. Are they aware that a student who is playing this cynically, student athlete, and his coach and his university are in on this, could pass 6 credits in the fall, 6, and still be eligible in the spring, and then never go to a class in the spring because he knows he's headed for the NBA draft, and still play all the way through the NCAA tournament and leave the university after 1 year with 6 credits. And that would not cause him or his university to run afoul of the NCAA. And we talked earlier, and I see Senator Murphy has arrived, so I'll wrap this up. We talked earlier about recruiting kids who are not able to function as true students. But that also includes, and I'm not trying to say that this is generally the case, but when it happens, it's jarring, and it happens more often than we'd like to acknowledge, where coaches are consciously recruiting people, not just with insufficient academic backgrounds, but with criminal records. We've had a number of universities with dozens and dozens of student athletes, so-called student athletes, with extensive criminal records. And then they find themselves in the NBA and the NFL because you have the ability to play. That's going to supersede everything else. And my last point would be this. If somehow we could, if not completely eliminate, substantially address those inequities and those objectionable aspects of college sports, the only people that would know the difference, if you weeded out all the people who should not be there because they have no intention of being students and they are being exploited to a certain extent, if you weeded all them out and they all wound up in farm systems of the NFL and the NBA, the only people who would be able to tell the difference would be NFL and NBA scouts. If North Carolina plays Wake Forest and the score is 78-75, you still have all the atmosphere of college, you still have all the alumni investment in it, it's still a close and entertaining game. That's all that matters. The quality of college sports, because the training has improved and the quality at every level is different. Baseball players are better now than they were a generation or two ago because of advanced training and whatnot. So, but the quality of what happened back in the day when Roger Staubach won the Heisman Trophy in the 1960s, those teams couldn't possibly compete with teams today. But those of us who watched it were engaged by it because it was fair competition. The games themselves were close and dramatic, and that's what makes sports entertaining. So all of the alumni who obsess over whether or not Alabama got this 5-star recruit as opposed to Auburn would still be fully entertained if all the people who didn't belong there were weeded out, and then Auburn and Alabama played and the game was close and everyone waved their pom-poms and rooted for the alma mater. It would not change at all except for the improvements.
Thank you, Bob. You know, Mark Emmert is stepping down as head of the NCAA. I wonder if you'd accept that job. I've been authorized to offer it to you.
Yeah.
Senator Murphy has indeed arrived, and I'd like to interrupt our discussion for a moment and invite Donna Lopiano up to present the National Public Service Award from the Drake Group.
Yeah. Stay right there, Senator, because I'm going to be a little wordy for sure. The 2022 National Public Service Award honors an elected public official responsible for advancing legislation that would significantly improve the conduct of intercollegiate athletic programs, enhance the rights of college athletes, or otherwise protect their education, health, and safety. In 2019, before NIL even became, common in the vernacular of the American sports fan, Senator Murphy educated members of Congress, educated members of the public about significant concerns related to the conduct of intercollegiate athletics through a series of 3 reports that many people in this room probably weren't aware of. The series was called Madness, Inc., and the first one was how everyone is getting rich off college sports except the players. The second one was how colleges keep athletes on the field and out of the classroom. The third one was how colleges leave athletes broken and abandoned. His commitment to educating members of Congress on this and the American public has been long-lasting. He has been the lead sponsor of several significant pieces of legislation that would enhance the rights of college athletes and improve the conduct of intercollegiate athletic programs. Just in the 117th Congress that we're in the middle of right now, or kind of at the end of, he sponsored the College Athlete Economic Freedom Act, which is an NIL bill. It would establish name, image, likeness, and athletic reputation rights for college athletes. He also sponsored the College Athlete Right to Organize Act, which we will discuss momentarily. And he also sponsored the standardization of collegiate oversight of revenues and expenditures, called the SCORE Act, which would amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to require institutions of higher education to report revenue generated by each sport program and for other purposes. In short, he's been a champion of athletes' rights and increasing the transparency of college athletic programs. I want to call Alan up to Alan Sack as our honoree. And I'd like to ask the senator to stand here next to Alan. He has been a champion for college athletes. Would you please congratulate our 2022 National Public Service Award recipient, the Honorable Christopher Murphy.
Senator Murphy, can I ask you to give us a brief explanation of your bill calling for the ability of college athletes to be able to unionize?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this. I'm deeply humbled to have this honor, and I will display it prominently and proudly, and really humbled as well to be on this panel and to really dig into this topic, which I think is one of the most important civil rights fights of our time, standing up for college athletes. There are obviously so many aspects of this debate. I come to this issue as a huge college sports fan, as somebody who wants to enjoy college sports for the next 50 years, and came to the conclusion that without reform, college sports as I know it wasn't going to be around in the same way, shape, or form. And so we are now at this very interesting moment where all of a sudden athletes have additional rights. Maybe they are on the cusp of acquiring even more rights or an even greater share of the massive amount of revenue that college sports programs make. And the question is, how do we set the rules? Right now, there are 50 different sets of rules. I think everybody would agree that in a national industry, in a sport that crosses state boundaries, that probably isn't the most efficient mechanism to create a level playing field going forward. And to me, the simplest way to decide what the rules are going forward about endorsements, about revenue sharing, about health and safety protocols, is for the athletes to be in a conversation with the schools, to have a discussion between those that are most affected by the rules as to what they are going to be going forward. The alternative is to have either 50 different state standards, which, as I said, everybody is uncomfortable with, or the federal government get involved. And as much as the NCAA wants the federal government right now to step in, I would just be careful what you wish for, right? I mean, I just don't know that it is in anybody's best interest for the federal government or the FTC to be regulating college sports in the long run, because we're sometimes good at passing one law, but then when circumstances change, you're stuck with that law forever. I mean, listen, we still have a law designed to regulate land phone lines, regulating the internet, right? And so I just am, listen, I've introduced a bill to provide a federal right to NIL, but I'm wary of proposals to have the federal government get involved in the sort of day-to-day regulation of college sports. And I'm also wary of every state government having their own rules. So to me, the middle ground really is to allow the parties to decide for themselves what those rules are. That to me is kind of a market-based solution in many ways. And of course, in order to do that, you have to create the right of the students to be able to collectively bargain, a right that doesn't, arguably, may not exist right now. And that's what this bill seeks to do.
Bob, do you want to jump in, or should I start with some questions?
One question I would have, Andy, and then you can take it from there, is to ask Senator Murphy how, if his bill were enacted, how does that affect the NCAA? Or how does the NCAA become involved in this in a constructive way?
Yeah, I think the bill contemplates options for students, and frankly, I would love for the NCAA and the industry to lead here and to not sit back and fight all of this reform. The options are that you could bargain collectively with your school, you could bargain collectively with your conference. I suppose there's a scenario in which you could bargain collectively with the NCAA or with a certain division level of the NCAA. And I just think it would be in the NCAA's interest to put a real reform proposal on the table. There may not be much of a role for the NCAA 10 years from now if they don't lead. I mean, we've already seen them become largely irrelevant in college football as the Power Five takes over. And soon I think the same thing may happen in college basketball. So in my mind, it's kind of up to the NCAA as to whether they're cut out in a world of collective bargaining when that bargaining happens directly with the schools or the conferences, or perhaps the NCAA gets progressive and says, no, we actually think this is an idea that might save us from over-regulation from the federal government or state governments, and we're going to step in, help the players set up a players association, bargain with them as a broader entity, and try to come up with a common understanding of the rules moving forward.
Senator, I'd like to hear your reflections on the following. If we open up college sports to unionization, and if college sports collective bargaining will fall under the aegis of the National Labor Relations Board, why would it be justifiable to open it up for that group of public employees and not other public employees who are involved in interstate commerce? I mean, there are a lot of public employees around our country who are exploited in their work and don't have the right to organize and don't have the right to protect their own interests. Why not have a bill that opens up that opportunity for those public employees along with college athletes?
Maybe I'm not understanding the question. What public employees are denied the right to enter into a collective bargaining relationship?
Well, in certain states, they're denied that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to pass a national law that gives the opportunity to college athletes, why not include other public employees who are involved in interstate commerce?
Well, I mean, I haven't thought of it outside of the realm of this particular issue, and so I'm certainly willing to consider that. I mean, again, I'm ultimately trying to solve a problem in a way that brings Republicans and Democrats together. Obviously, Republicans generally have an aversion to anything that provides collective bargaining rights, and if you lumped in sort of additional categories of workers, you probably make this bill even harder to pass. Again, the way I frame this is that this is the market-based solution to this problem, and the alternative is to have potentially heavy-handed regulation from either state governments or federal governments. And so I'll have to think more about that question. I think my initial reaction is the more narrow it is, the more likely it is to ultimately get passed or be part of the solution.
So some of your framing of what you're calling a market-based solution now is on the grounds that you don't think the federal government can regulate parts of the economy, but the federal government already regulates large parts of the economy. And don't we have to figure out how to do that better rather than walking away from that function?
Yeah, listen, I'm not saying the federal government can't do this. And listen, I think actually you can marry together the bill that Senator Booker has with a collective bargaining right? I mean, this is sort of generally what you do is you create a floor of rights that every worker enjoys, and then they bargain for compensation or protections on top of that floor, right? We don't make you bargain for basic health and safety protections if you work in the mining industry. That's in law, and then you bargain for rights on top of that. And so the protections that are in Corey's bill, which I'm very, very supportive of, I think work hand in hand with the ability to then go above and beyond that. It's again, when we're talking about, you've seen just how unbelievably fast these endorsement deals have, the mechanics around these endorsement deals work. I was, just on the phone a few days ago with a Power 5 coach talking to me about the collectives and how quickly and fast the collectives are organizing and marketing to students. I just think for those kind of fast-moving dynamics, you'd be better off in a collective bargaining relationship where you can change the terms of the agreement every couple of years rather than in a regulatory scheme, which is much more sclerotic.
So as I understand it, the projection that you're making about how collective bargaining would evolve at the college level is that it would happen conference by conference. You'd have a multi-employer bargaining unit, so all the schools in a conference would come together and sign a collective bargaining agreement with the athletes. Is that?
Well, again, I am maybe not totally agnostic on this question, but I want to provide some flexibility so that the players and the schools and the NCAA can sort of come in and do the right thing. So we allow for the bargaining to happen on a conference-by-conference basis. But again, I don't think we should foreclose the possibility that bargaining could happen on a broader basis, Division I sports, multiple conferences. Ultimately, like in many other industries, bargaining units look different, and flexibility is often given to the employees to define those units.
So if you did it on a division basis, then you'd have some schools that have annual revenue of $5 million and other schools that have annual revenue of $250 million. It seems improbable that would be a successful way to organize the bargaining. But if you do it at a conference level, how do you deal with the fact that conferences are changing all the time? Right now, there's a lot of movement from schools move from one conference to another. If you look at what happens in Europe with collective bargaining, the athletes' unions are really weak, and part of the reason for that, in my judgment, is they have multiple leagues that teams belong to. So, how would you deal with it if Wisconsin all of a sudden decided to go to the SEC instead of staying in the Big Ten, but each of those conferences had different collective bargaining agreements?
I mean, listen, I don't claim to be a labor lawyer, right? So you're asking me this is all governed by state and federal labor law. So you're into the weeds right now in a way that I'm necessarily not equipped to answer. But what I know is that if you try to create some corollaries here, there are companies that have different owners and different stakeholders. Those stakeholders constantly change, and yet that doesn't abrogate the bargaining rights of the employees. So there's plenty of instances in the private sector in which the members of the company change, the composition of the company changes, but the company's relationship with the workers does not. So. Listen, I'm not saying I understand the unique nature of presenting athletes, 18-year-olds who are only on campus for 2 or 4 years with bargaining rights commensurate to those in the private sector. I get it. But if we're not thinking of unique ways to solve this problem, then we're not going to solve it because it is a bit of a unicorn, the college sports industry. So I understand there's going to be some square pegs and round holes here. I just fundamentally think that these kids deserve to have a seat at the table, and this bill provides them with the structure to have that seat.
Do you have any concerns about the financial implications of allowing unionization in college sports? I mean, the last pre-pandemic NCAA report on finances at the FBS level, the top 130 schools, said that the median program in FBS had an $18.8 million deficit. And that's a deficit that comes out of the hides of children, the students who are at the school. It comes out of the hide of the federal government, which supports higher education to the tune of $150 billion a year. $100 billion of that is in loans and grants to students. So if we pass collective bargaining and it results in wages, substantial wages, one would hope if they're going to be successful, what happens to that deficit? And what happens to the central budget at these colleges that have to further subsidize the athletic programs?
Well, listen, I fundamentally don't buy this idea that college sports is only worthwhile if it makes money. I mean, my high school did not make money off of its sports programs. It provided sports programs because it thought it was important to the well-rounded education of its high school students. And so this idea, and listen, it comes up over and over again, right? If you make the football programs pay the players, that money's going to come from the volleyball program. Well, this whole idea that college sports are only legitimate if they make money is ridiculous. And it's the industry's own fault that they have created an environment that is so big and so expensive that by providing a little bit of the share of the revenue to the players, they sort of threaten the whole enterprise. I would also argue that at least when you're talking about the biggest programs, where I think the injustice is the most significant, you don't have to rob from Olympic sports in order to compensate football players. If Coach Harbaugh's salary every year was just $1 million a year, right? If he was able to get by on $1 million a year, and I know that's hard to imagine, then just through that one adjustment to one coach's salary, every single player on the University of Michigan football team could get a $40,000 a year stipend. And that doesn't impact any other program at the University of Michigan. That just means that one guy has to make a little bit less money. And I know that that doesn't work at every program, but I'm just using it as an example of why it's not always the sky falls for every other athletic program if you help the kids a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that last point is a very good one. Oh, Bob, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll make it brief because we want to hear from Mr. Hausfeld and Ms. McCullough as well. But I'd like to ask Senator Murphy to respond to a point that was made before he arrived. If the college presidents had the will and the courage to say, we will monitor all admissions of athletes in the revenue-producing sports to make sure that each of those athletes could plausibly meet the basic standards of our university, acknowledging that universities have different standards, but they all have standards, so that this student would meet the standard that we would apply to a non-athlete looking to be part of this university. And then we will monitor that person's academic progress as they move along and eliminate those that can't meet that standard. Over the objections of the coach who wants to win and is obsessed with recruiting, over the objections of the athletic director who has to explain it to the supporters and the alumni. Here is the simple thing. All the other ancillary issues here, which are important, but at the core of it, we will not admit any student athlete who does not have a legitimate chance to be a legitimate student if the football or basketball program did not exist. If we were to do that and then realign our understanding of what the compensation is, I have no problem with NIL. And all the other reforms you're talking about, Senator Murphy, I'm in agreement with 90% of it, I would think. It bothers me less if some quarterback somewhere gets $100,000 from the local car dealership. That doesn't bother me at all. But if that quarterback isn't going to class, that bothers me quite a bit. And I think even when the reformers, let alone the people who only care about bringing the best athletes, and they really wouldn't care, the fan of a team wouldn't care if you asked them, which would you prefer? Over the next 5 years, we'll be competitive and maybe go to a bowl game, but everyone will be a legitimate student on our team. Or we'll win the national championship 3 of those 5 years, and half of these students will be functionally illiterate. We know that many of those boosters would choose B. So we know how they feel about it. But even when we glibly say everyone's making money here except the athletes, I think, Senator Murphy, we're overlooking, and I'm not saying you are, but we as a group are overlooking this point, the kid sitting next to the football or basketball player in class, his parents may have worked 2 and 3 jobs to put him through school. And if this student athlete really was a student, the benefit there over 4 years, or in some cases 5 or 6, and it would make sense to me if the kid was a legitimate student, that you could extend that scholarship for additional years because we're asking them to practice, asking them to travel. But if they're going to be a legitimate student, that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when we say everyone's making money here except the students, those students are being given something, those student athletes are being given something that is of great value if they value it.
Yeah, listen, I think that that if you have achieved a level of accomplishment in a sport such that you are playing at a high level in college, you are a pretty extraordinary human being. You have shown a pretty substantial commitment, a work ethic, right, a determination that I would argue will allow you to succeed in a college environment if the college gives you the space to succeed. So I don't necessarily know that it's a question of admissions. It's a question of allowing the student to be a student. I mean, if you want these kids to succeed, then don't force them to spend, I heard you talking about this, Bob, when I came in, 40, 60 hours on your on your sport, allow them to become students. The other piece of this is that I think it's a little unfair, right, to narrow the aperture of kids' ability to get into big-time football or college sports programs when that is the minor leagues. That's the minor leagues. You can't go straight to the NFL from high school. There's a cabal between the colleges and the NFL. And so to sort of say, hey, you need to commit yourself to being a student, despite the fact that you absolutely have a pathway to the pros, when there's no other way to get there, I think is a little bit of a trap for these kids. And of course, they're figuring it out. I mean, that's why more and more kids are avoiding, at least for basketball, college sports altogether. So I think so long as these are the minor leagues, then you have to admit that some of these kids very rationally are thinking to themselves, I'm going to spend all my time working on my sport because that's how I'm ultimately going to make the most money. And if you give them an alternative to college sports, then maybe you can crack down a little bit harder in the university context. But right now, for those really, really talented athletes, that's their only route.
So why not have a bill that tells the NFL they have to create minor league football instead of putting the burden on colleges to develop football players?
Well, you know what? It's interesting. I've had some interesting conversations with Republicans on this issue. Some Republicans who are going to have a lot to say about any legislation that moves through Congress are very skeptical of Congress saying anything about NIL or collective bargaining, but have been very receptive to a very simple bill that says the NFL can't stop you from going straight into the league from high school, and the NBA can't do that either. And so there might be interest in just sort of ending that collusion between college sports and the pros that exists most egregiously in football, but still to an extent in basketball.
Senator, I'm told that you have not a lot of time to spend with us, and I don't want to take advantage of you. So I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure that others do as well, that I'd love to continue talking to you about. But how much time do we have to continue with you?
I am not the keeper of my schedule, so no, I guess we are done. So I apologize. We have votes on the floor of the Senate this morning, so I think Peter is saying I'm overdue.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
So Kai, I'd like to turn to you and ask your perspective on what unionization would mean to the life of a soccer player.
I know it's definitely a different world. Even just hearing about the experiences of some of my football friends. My dad was a football athlete at UCLA as well when he was a young 20-year-old. So just seeing the difference between the experiences of football players and basketball players in these more revenue-creating sports is a different world. But I think unionization offers the ability of athletes to advocate for themselves in a way that they aren't really able to now. In my own experience, and again, most of this is just based on my own experience and the experience of a lot of the friends that I've made throughout college, across campuses, there's so many instances of times when athletes often, I would use the word coerce, feel coerced to not say anything about their programs. We're talking abuse in women's sports. We're talking, I have a football friend who was actually cut from the program for trying to advocate for his own health and safety. And so I think unionization really offers a promise for athletes to collectively bargain for rights that they're just not granted now. The reality is that there aren't health and safety mandates now. There aren't mental health protections. Unfortunately, for those of you who follow college sports, there's been around 6 deaths by suicides of student athletes in the past 2 months. So it's really a mental health crisis happening. And like I said, this system is so oppressive and has really real impacts on young adults and teenagers. I think when we're talking about the theoretical bits of all of this, we forget that fundamentally you go into this landscape as a teenager and you're forced to compete and lay your body on the line and your mental health on the line and sacrifice some of your educational benefits in order to perform for your sport. And when you contextualize this system in the way that it harms individuals who are still trying to just figure out adulthood, I think collective action and collective bargaining and unionization is a solution that offers hope and offers promise for young athletes to sort of take some of their power back.
Michael, do you have any thoughts about how unionization would fit with college athletes?
I'd answer that question, yes, but how many years do you have for me to give you the answer? I don't think unionization is the answer as a title. I do believe the concept of collective bargaining is essential in reestablishing the balance of a necessary relationship between the athlete, the school, the conference, and the NCAA. I agree with the senator that it would probably be among the worst products if Congress sought to legislate the collective bargaining terms between athletes and colleges and divisions, conferences. I would use the phrasing growing up. We would read in the law books back in the 1700s that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, passed certain legislation. Those words have been absent in most judicial decisions that have been formulated regarding acts of recent Congresses. But the principle behind collective bargaining is to provide labor peace. And clearly, college sports needs labor peace. And just in using the term college sports itself, we miss the 2 divergent poles. One is the academics, because universities are not institutions for the advancement of professional sports athletes. And the other, as Mr. Costa said, is entertainment. In one case that we had, the chancellor of a university responsible for 40,000 students made $600,000 a year. The football coach, responsible for the lives of 100 students, made $9 million a year. Who was in control? Where is the drive with regard to the divergent pulls on the athlete between responding to the coach or responding to the chancellor? Putting some rounding to the pegs that Senator Murphy talked about, the holes, there are ways to achieve collective bargaining through an association which avoids all of the both objective and subjective, possibly antipathy to the term union. If there was an association of college athletes that allowed them to bargain collectively for academic rights, bargain collectively for their athletic rights, and as well as figure out how to bargain with the overall integrated system of what we call college sports, because the non-revenue sports in college are dependent upon the revenue that the revenue-producing sports provide. If not, then public institutions, are forced to seek increases in state taxes to provide for the additional monies that have now been chased after in order to provide for those non-revenue sports to be continued. So you need something where the athletes can talk to the schools so that their academic integrity is protected, and they're given the opportunity, as Mr. Costa said, an opportunity which sports does provide to many underprivileged, many minority athletes to go to college and get an education which is worthwhile. They deserve that. They deserve to be able to talk to their universities about that, as opposed to just having the rules told to them. They deserve being able to speak to their athletic divisions or conferences. What are my requirements for practice? What are your protections in terms of insurance for my safety and health? But then overall, there should be some means of taking that revenue, giving a fairer balance between the athlete and the student, and the revenue-producing sport and the non-revenue-producing sport, so that there's a pool, as there is, for example, in the March Madness, where that money is not all given to the winning institutions, but there is some allocation of that money among all the institutions, so that the sports can be continued, regardless of race, gender, division, or conference.
So it's interesting to me to hear your view that collective bargaining rights would produce labor peace in college sports. It certainly hasn't worked that way in the NFL, the NBA, and Major League Baseball or soccer. Do we want to live in a world where student athletes go on strike, or where the universities or conferences lock them out? If you're going to have collective bargaining, the laborers, the workers, have as their strongest weapon the ability to strike. I'm not sure that it all leads to labor peace. Certainly there are many reforms that need to happen, many protections that need to happen, particularly in the area of health and safety, and particularly in the area of a robust education. And I guess Senator Murphy and others feel like it's paternalistic to have national legislation that mandates those things, because the NCAA clearly has not implemented them properly. But how much paternalism would there be if you have several unions? I think it'd have to be one union per conference. Who's going to run the unions? Is there going to be some international union that is sending in bargainers? Are the athletes themselves going to be more democratically represented in a case like that, where the athletes are spending 40 to 60 hours or more on their sport. They're supposedly also spending 40 hours plus being students. And how much time do they have to be involved in a union and make the union democratic and truly representing their interests? And, Michael, the other thing that you said that I think is terribly important, I'd love to hear everybody's point of view on this. It seems to me, I don't take the view that Senator Murphy ascribed to me, which is that to be viable you have to have a surplus in college athletics. I'm sort of making the opposite point, which is there is an existing median deficit in the FBS, the top 130 schools athletically in the country, a median deficit of $18.8 million per school's athletic program, and that doesn't include many capital expenses, so the actual deficit is larger than that. If you have collective bargaining and if the athletes are paid, that deficit's going to get larger. Now, in the longer run, college coaches their salaries will adjust because now they're getting paid the value that their athletes they recruit produce. In the long run, when the current contracts are over, their salaries will come down. And it's not just a matter of Coach Harbaugh or Coach Saban getting $10, $11, $12 million a year. It's their assistant coaching staff. There are 11 assistant coaches. Those guys are pulling down collectively over $10 million as well. Why not go after that problem directly and confer upon the NCAA or another national governing organization the ability to control coaches' compensation? Why do we have to create unionization to have some backdoor mechanism that might eventually lead to controlling coaches' salaries? But the deficit that I'm concerned about is not because I think athletic programs need to turn a surplus or turn a profit. It's because I think right now they're draining the educational budget at those schools. And that's falling, a large part of that burden falls on students, and a large part of it falls on the federal government. But the other aspect of the deficit is that I am very worried about Olympic sports, and I'm even more worried about women's sports. I'm worried about Title IX. If we have to spend more money, or colleges have to spend more money supporting their football team, more money supporting their men's basketball team, perhaps maybe a women's soccer team or basketball team as well, then what happens to the transfer mechanism that's existed for decades that takes surpluses that are generated in most FBS football programs and sends them to support women's sports? I think that's a really important question. And the larger question that we keep coming back to is, what about the fact that students are at these schools, at least nominally, to get an education? Over 98% of football players and men's basketball players in college never play a single game in the NBA or the NFL. If we're worried about exploitation, then let's give these guys a robust education that they can use for the rest of their lives, that, as Bob has alluded to several times, the average return to 4 years of college education in the United States is over $1 million. Let's give them a real opportunity to do that, to earn that income over their lifetime. Any comments about my comments?
I had a professor who was asked, I had a professor who always responded to a very similar question that was asked by his students. And one student asked him, says, "Why is it that you always answer a question with a question?" And he said, "Why not?"
Thank you.
So the question that Andy poses is one that provides an answer that both of us really agree on. The ideal of college sports and college athletes is laudable. The concept is not broken. The system is. And it's hard work to figure out how to put that system back together when it really has diverged from the initial principle of a university, which was to educate, as opposed to the principal objective of a business, which is to make money. How do we put that together with all of the complexities that Andrew, and Mr. Casas have identified for us. It's not easy, but someone's got to figure it out, because otherwise there will be no labor peace, no equality, no fairness in a system that involves so many different interests, from junior high school all the way through college graduation, from gender, from race, from basically geography, which school you pick. Is there really an equality monetarily between what a scholarship is worth at an Ivy League school as opposed to what a college, is what a scholarship is worth in a non-Ivy League school? There are disparities throughout the entire system. How do we adjust for this now when we clearly, I think, have reached the general proposition that the system is not working, and what system can be put in its place?
Andy, the point that Michael just made is really a salient point, that the concept is still good, but the system is desperately in need of reform. And I think even among the reformers, there's a fundamental mistake when we say that the athletes are generating all the revenue, and that's part of the exploitation. The truth is that the revenue and the attention is largely generated by the traditions and the institutions themselves. Go play football someplace other than Notre Dame and see how many people are interested in watching you play football, or other than Alabama, or wherever it might be. So that this doesn't get them off the hook for exploitation or for failing to institute reforms that are needed. But the idea, and I think a lot of young athletes and people who look at it cynically are walking around with this idea that we generate all of it. No, you don't. You're a transitory part of long-standing systems that may be in need of reform, but without them, without those institutions, without the histories, without the rivalry, without public interest in it, which would not exist absent the identification with those schools and their histories, without that, then there's no place for you to play football or basketball in most cases that anyone would pay any attention to. And again, I go back, and it's the last time I'll say it, but to the idea that these athletes are getting nothing out of it. If it's a legitimate, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, through NIL and everything else and stipends, I'm all for it. But even without that, if there were an understanding here that had integrity, that there has to be an appropriate relationship between academics and athletics, you could never say to a full scholarship athlete, you're really not getting enough out of this. You're not getting anything out of it. Yeah, you are. If you go to class for 4 or 5 years, you're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars right there of value. And then, as you said, Andy, the studies show that someone who graduates from college and was a legitimate student there is apt to make about $1 million more than a comparable person who does not have that academic background.
Yeah. Other comments? Kaya?
Yeah, I'm just on that point. I think that ideal is great. We would love to be able to say that football players and student athletes are getting their fair compensation through education, but I think to that point, the fact of the matter is they're not. And I think, we've talked about it a bunch on this panel alone. It's just there needs to be reforms put in place to ensure that if we are sort of touting that as an ideal, that is actually happening, because I can sit here and tell you right now that it's not. If we are using education as that shiny apple that we're holding in front of people, then there needs to be reform put in place that education is actually happening and that students are actually being graduated, and especially students of color and students who come from diverse backgrounds, that they're getting the proper help and support to create an education that will help them in the long run. And I feel like in a lot of ways, the institutions just aren't doing that. And I think a lot of the exploitation comes in then because their labor is being used so extensively to perform and to generate money. So I definitely think that education should be valued a lot more, but it's just not. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're here discussing this today. It's not being sort of uplifted in the way that it should, and in the ideal that we all are discussing right now.
Yeah. So I think one of the underlying themes that we're discussing both directly and indirectly this morning is exploitation. And I think that there's an element of exploitation in the current system that's particularly noxious, and that is that in FBS football and FBS basketball, a majority of the players, more than 50% of the players, are black. And they're, even though Bob is completely correct that it's not the players alone that are generating the revenue, but the players are contributing, certainly the institution and the physical infrastructure the institution provides and the history of the institution, all of that contributes. But the top basketball players and the top football players who are getting a yearly scholarship that's worth $70,000 or $80,000 perhaps, they're producing more value than that, and they are getting exploited. I wonder whether unionization or turning the athletes into employees is really going to solve that issue. Think about it, because Senator Murphy didn't want to get into details, but I think the devil is in the details. What is the union going to be asking for? Should all of the athletes, the 85 scholarship athletes on an FBS football team, should all of them be getting the same wage? And if they're all getting the same wage, then we're still going to be exploiting the star quarterback or the star halfback or whoever it might be, because he is getting the same wage as somebody who's the third string safety. And so how are we going to ultimately deal with this question of exploitation? It seems to me one of the necessary reforms that has to happen in college sports is the university should be paying for loss of income insurance for the athletes. So a lot of athletes will get injured in college and lose the opportunity to make millions of dollars in the pros. Some colleges are now offering loss of income insurance. They're paying for, sometimes they get the athlete to pay for it or somebody else to pay for it. Sometimes the colleges are paying for it. If we don't want to exploit these athletes, we should be providing them with loss of income insurance. So, once again, I think there are more direct measures that can be taken other than unionization that will deal head on with the problems. Another question I have, and I'd like to throw this out to the rest of the panel. If athletes become employees, which the NLRB chief counsel now seems to think they ought to be, and there is a movement to do that, how are we going to decide how many hours a week these employees are working? Because of course, if they are employees, then they get covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they get paid a minimum wage, and they get paid time and a half for overtime. But how do we know how many hours they're working? Well, you can add up the amount of time they spend on the basketball court or the football field, and the weight with the training room, and watching films, and traveling. You could add all that up. But what about the hours they spend studying? To be eligible to play college football, you have to have a certain academic record. It's not a very high record, but you have to have a certain level of achievement. You have to be getting passing grades in a minimum number of courses. So therefore, the time they spend studying for their classes is part of the requirement that they have to put in order to play football or basketball. Are we going to add those hours up as well? I think there are a lot of questions here when we say, okay, let's treat them as employees because we don't want them to be exploited. A lot of questions that have to be answered because, as everybody is pointing out, the problems here are complex and they're interrelated. And the idea that you can have a piecemeal reform to address one of the problems and leave unattended all the others is not going to work.
And what you just said is you have an integrated system, and it really is college sports. It's not any one college alone. It's the sports played in all colleges together, which comprise the amalgam of college sports. And there are individual questions, a multiplicity of them, within that general description of college sports. How do you address them? Taking the term that's been used, exploitation, but we all tend to think of that solely in terms of monetary exploitation, economics. Yeah, are athletes getting a fair share? Yes, you cannot underestimate the value of a meaningful education in terms of what your career prospects are worth once you get out, if you've been fully and meaningfully educated. But as Kaya just said, that's not true for a good portion of the athletes. So they're being exploited academically because they're not being given the chance to get that meaningful education, or there are flaws in the system which deprive them of that education. The coach will call up some of the professors and say, hey, pass this person. We need him on the team, or her on the team. That's not a meaningful education. And in terms of what value there is, yeah, somebody, on some team might make $1 million, but then again, the NCAA last year made $15 billion. Is that imbalance? This is not to say, again, that everyone within the system gets to get some inordinate amount by themselves. What a wage is not being necessarily discussed between at least Andrew and myself and Mr. Casas and Kaya. We're not talking about wages. We're talking about what would be a fair allocation of that $15 billion to the athletes as a whole. And then you can have them supplemented by individual NILs or whatever. But all of these issues cannot be the subject of one treaty, whether it be decreed by Congress or some greater, authority. It's got to be worked out. And it's going to evolve as the athletes leave, because they are transitory, and they need protection as well. As again was just pointed out, what about the athlete who gets injured in their senior year and then cannot play professional when they possibly did have an opportunity to do that? What about the athlete that graduates and then develops illnesses associated, with their playing the sport in college? They have no health insurance. They're not covered. All of these are individual questions that need to be answered, but answered on a constant basis with some ability to address them to the appropriate stakeholders. The universities separately, the conferences separately, and possibly even whatever organization may replace the NCAA, which clearly has outlived its purpose.
Andy, to a number of the points that have been made here, for some reason I can't hear the applause, so I don't want to jump all over Michael's applause, which he has justly earned. I can hear the speakers, and I can see just in the foreground a few people clapping, but for some reason I can't hear it. So I didn't mean to step on your standing ovation. You and I are very familiar, Andy, with the Major League Baseball Players Association, and the distinction between that and a true union. They establish, and rightly so, the terms and conditions of employment, minimum salaries, and things that govern trades and other player rights. But then the players are individual contractors, and they negotiate their monetary deals with the teams. If that were in place in college sports, you'd just have chaos. So to me, if you're going to have a stipend and you're going to have all the conditions that Michael laid out, make sure that the medical aspects are taken care of, and that there's collective bargaining about how much practice time there should be and under what conditions travel should take place and all that sort of thing. That's all fine. But once that's in place, the last guy on the bench, if he's a scholarship athlete or she, has to get the same amount as a superstar player. But the superstar player has that pot of gold at the end once they've left college with prospects of going pro, but also within college, when NIL is fully in place, if that person can make $1 million in endorsement deals, why shouldn't he or she be able to do that? But that's not coming directly from the university. The university should not be in the business of saying that we are making a distinction between a starter and a reserve, between a star and who's a first-round draft pick and somebody who might be a third-round draft pick. That would be not only unfair, but it would be chaotic.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good point that separates the NIL discussion as a source of income for athletes and the possibility of wages or salaries. I do think, as I've suggested before, I do think that the details are important. And so let me clarify one thing that Michael just said. So he referred to the NCAA as generating $15 billion a year. That's the sum total. That's an estimate of the sum total that's generated by all of the college athletic programs. The NCAA itself, and I'm very willing to criticize them and to declare their demise, or I would look forward to being able to do that. But the NCAA itself really generates 95% of its income from March Madness. And most of that is, almost all of that is television money. So the amount of money that Mark Emmert and his gang in Indianapolis get every year is on the order of $1.1 billion out of the $15 billion. So yes, they're wasteful, and yes, they don't do their job, but they don't have $15 billion at their disposal. The other point I want to make about NILs is that I totally endorse, not necessarily endorse the way they're being implemented right now, but I endorse the concept because, as Bob and Michael pointed out, it's a third party that's paying them. It doesn't change their relationship to the university as a student at the university. But NIL income, you know what? I just lost the point that I was going to make, so I'm going to have to come back. I have too many side points when I talk. So I'm going to stop there, and maybe I'll be able to share my point with you later on. We'll find out. Are there any other thoughts about this? Maybe we have time if somebody in the audience, looks like, is there a question back there? Oh, yes. Go ahead. By the way, while you're preparing your question, I remembered my point. I think one of the things about NILs is that a lot of the money that is supporting NILs is money that used to go directly to the athletic department, used to be through sponsorships, other kind of endorsement deals. That money is now being diverted to the student athletes, and that's fine. But the financial problems that we've been talking about are going to get worse as a result of that. The average FBS program gets about $8 or $9 million a year from sponsorships. Some of that money is now going directly to students. It's going to enlarge the deficits that we were talking about. Your question in the back.
Yeah, hey. Can you hear me? Yeah, Dr. Jen Fry. So my question is, you said you're focused on the details. What if we changed how we define this idea of student athlete? Because that's where the problem's occurring. And so as we know, the former president, Walter Myers, literally said, we crafted the term student athlete, and soon it was embedded in all NCAA rules and interpretations. The term came because they did not want to pay the widow of Ray Denton money from his injury. So what if we started referring to them as a college athlete? Because how we define them kind of infantiles them, right? We're calling them kids. These are grown folks. So what does it look like if we change the definition? Because the reality is this spectrum of uneducated athletes is the far-reaching. Many of them are actually not sitting next to people who work 2 and 3 jobs. Many of them are sitting next to legacy kids, donor kids, kids that the president brought in because of the money. So what does it look like if we change how we talk about them as college athletes, worthy of making money? Because in reality, when a March Madness team makes it to the Sweet 16, they bring in admissions. People want to come play. So they are critical to admissions, they're critical to the success of a university. So what if we change the narrative and call them college athletes, worthy of making money because they're putting their bodies on the line? And how would that change then how we make these type of unionization definitions and attempts to unionize?
Bob, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, certainly the point that was made is valid. Just take one example. and it may be an extreme example, but when Doug Flutie won the Heisman Trophy at Boston College in the 1980s, applications for admission to Boston College, which is a very good academic institution, jumped appreciably because of the attention that that brought. And the point that was made, the larger point, not regarding any individual, a university makes it to the Final Four, goes deep into the NCAA tournament, that does raise the profile of that university. On the other hand, if student athletes or college athletes are perceived as not really being students, that hurts the prestige of that university. It seems to me that the points that the questioner made can be aligned with a legitimate academic and an athletic experience. The idea that we should separate the two or not have equal regard for each of them, and that they're just college athletes and therefore are employees first and foremost, I don't see that model being sustainable.
Go ahead, sure, go ahead.
In all of our work with college athletes, we've always referred to them as college athletes because there is a subtle, undercurrent associated with student athlete, as was said by the speaker, that somehow or other, they're just there doing extracurricular activities, for the benefit of the school and in pursuit of an education which they really may or may not be getting. But changing the name alone is not going to change the system. And it's the system that's broken, not the ideal. And what I would like to put out as a challenge to this group, we've got to educate the population as well as the politicians that college athletes are not dispensable pieces, of an entertainment puzzle. They belong in a system, and they should be treated accordingly with respect and dignity and fairly. It's up to all of us to change the terminology, to change the concept. If you wrote about it, if we talked more openly about it, if we gathered the support that is necessary to try to figure out what system will fit what is necessary to achieve the ideal. That is what's got to happen on behalf of the efforts of all of us.
It's important that to make when we see, like during the NCAA tournament, and someone from the press department brings in the players who have excelled for post-game interviews. Are there any further questions for these student athletes? The hypocrisy, the piety of that. It's like the IOC, trotting out all of their platitudes and then returning to authoritarian regimes to hold the next Olympics. But just because we are revolted by that hypocrisy and that false piety doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a student-athlete relationship, and that isn't attainable, as Michael has said. The concept is a laudable one, and while we'll never have it perfectly, the idea that it should be thrown out and that it doesn't matter at all will only lead to chaos, and will lead to us being involved in something that isn't worthy. If it's just a semi-pro operation, then let it operate as a semi-pro operation. And you would soon find out that the number of athletes who could avail themselves of that would be exponentially smaller, because then the only people you'd be interested in would be those who had a chance to be professionals, those who were so good that they could entertain the masses and generate profit from it. The vast majority of, as Andy said, the vast majority of college athletes overall, especially in the non-revenue producing sports, but even in the revenue producing sports, will not make a dollar as professional athletes, direct compensation. So the idea here has got to be, how do we align this with the legitimate purpose of a university and have it be, even though it's a more glorified example of this, have playing a sport be an extracurricular activity. part of the answer to that isn't necessarily to think about how to compensate people for practice time. Maybe it's to cut back the practice time. Maybe it's to downsize some of this. Now that may be unattainable because that horse is out of the barn and it's galloping further and further away even as we speak. But if we abandon the whole ideal and just say, screw it, I just don't see where that leaves us.
So I think we have time for one more question. It's over here.
How are you doing? I'm Brendan Cole. So I guess my question is more for Bob, and I was trying to remember my question as you were talking, so I might have missed some things. But so earlier you were saying how the president will get involved in the admissions process to make sure the university is getting the right type of student, like the one that wants to be there for education. And so as an athlete myself, my question is more so, what is the right type of student? Because it's the right type of student, the kid, and I have a lot of friends who are doing this, who were trying to take Adderall all night to stay up to pass a test. Is that the right type of student? Is the right type of student the guy who's going to football practice at 5 a.m. every morning and doing his job? Because I think we have to be very careful with language and how we phase who the right type of student is, especially when we're referring to college basketball and college football. Because to me, as a college football player, I know the demographic that makes up college basketball and college football. And my point, to finish it off, I know everybody's ready to wrap up, is we have to figure out when we say value in education, because critical race theory has showed us that education has a lot of layers to it, to what the term education means. So trying to tell me, how to learn about a hedge fund is more important than, something I learned in African American history. That's debatable. And so I just feel like we have to be very, very careful saying student athletes should value this education we're giving them. Because a lot of the times the education we're getting is not even the education that's real. But, and this is my final point, this is my final point, I promise. Me going through college, I went to Hampton University, which I feel is a very prestigious HBCU. And the greatest thing I learned, I got my undergrad and master's, the greatest thing I learned in all my classes was sitting in an entrepreneurship class, and the teacher asked everybody, hey, what do you want to do when you get older? What do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to play football in the NFL. He said, okay, that's a great idea, but why don't you want to own an NFL team, right? So I was like, it's a great question. So I went and got on the business side of sports, and that landed me as an athletic director at one of the top private schools in DC. But I think that was my piece of education. I don't think anybody would have said, oh, that's the thing. Like, what about your economics class or stuff like that? So that was kind of like my question to Bob. So back to the right type of student, to sum it up.
Well, I think that while you make some legitimate points, you have inferred something which I did not imply. I'm talking about someone who's able to meet, regardless of what demographic category that person comes from, someone who's able to meet the basic educational standards, whatever they may be, and those educational standards vary. Ohio State's is not the same as Yale's or whatever, but within reason, able to be plausibly a functioning student. Now, what that student makes of it, the point that the questioner makes, is completely legitimate. No one's saying that the only legitimate education is whatever the classic liberal arts education was perceived to be generations ago. But if you're at a university and you're going to be serious about it, and you're equipped, if you apply yourself, to derive something of value out of that education, and you're reasonably committed to that, as the questioner was, then you're way above what that bar would be. I think my point still holds and is not in opposition to the points that the questioner made.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank Michael and Kaya and Bob for their really interesting comments. And thank you all for listening. And our next panel begins in about 10 minutes, I believe. So thank you.